So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 12th Real Business of Wine session. And tonight we're doing data. And the first thing I want to say about data, which is, I think, the most important thing to say, really, is that data is not like toilet roll. The thing about toilet roll, essentially, you buy it, if you can get hold of it, it will do the job. There is very bad data, there is very good data. And bad data is pretty useless. And the wine industry, to me, actually isn't historically very good at the whole data business. I think far too many people in this industry rely on the thing that they have heard or seen. And I keep hearing people saying, everyone's drinking natural wine. And you say, so yes, where are you based? Yeah, I'm in Brooklyn, or I'm in a very trendy bit of Tokyo or downtown in Paris or whatever. I said, so can you come down to my local supermarket and show me, even my local wine shop, can you show me a natural wine in that store? No. And there's so much that we hear that isn't real. And by the same token, there's stuff happening in one country that we don't see anywhere else. And so in the US, we'll hear today, red blends, people are buying red blend wine at $50, $60. An idea that in Germany or in Britain is probably almost unthinkable. So I'd like to introduce our panel this evening, and there are three people, they're three friends, so I'm really happy to have, particularly from left to right on my screen. Lulie Halstead, who is one of the two bosses of Wine Intelligence, which is the world leading, by a long chalk, data provider in terms of consumer attitudes towards wine, and a consultancy within that field across the world. Dr. Simone Loose from Geisenheim University is the data queen, both in Germany and looking at the world beyond that. And last time Simone and I were together, we were talking about some work she'd been doing for the Provine, under the sort of aegis of Provine, looking at which countries of the world the wine industry was most interested in progressing. And on the right, the only other man in this panel, Paul Mabray, who has been involved with data for a very long time and is in Napa rather than San Francisco, unlike the bridge behind him. But Paul has looked at all sorts of data from the extent of where people are going in traveling around Napa, to which influencers they're looking at, what they're talking about online. And he is now the CEO of a business called Emmetry, which I'm sure he'll say a few words about, but we're not all here to plug what we do. And in terms of looking at data in the big picture. So I'd like to start with Lulie, because you are very, very international in what Wine Intelligence does. What to you are the biggest challenges in gathering data in terms of consumer attitudes to wine globally, looking from China to the UK to the US and everywhere else?
Thanks, Robert, and thanks very much for the invitation to be with you today. I think the biggest challenge we have in wine is that we're such a fragmented category from a brand perspective. So if we compare ourselves to our colleagues and friends in beer, in cider, in spirits, we have such a plethora of brands that actually collecting and collating reliable and valid, two very important words when we're talking about research, data becomes quite complex. One of the other issues in wine in terms of research, particularly consumer research, is that as a result of that, for many wine businesses, or indeed any other spend, to allocate that to an area which, historically wasn't a primary objective of wine businesses as agricultural and production businesses.
I think one of the things that I've found looking at from the outside is you also have that problem of people have their own baggage when it comes to wine. And you obviously do focus groups and you look at people doing one-to-one interviews. But I found that people will want to say, well, they're actually nervous about either saying they don't know Bordeaux or don't like Bordeaux or whatever. There feels like a right answer. By the same token, when you ask how much money do you spend on wine, there's that looking around the room. If you say, I spend $25, is that a ludicrously high figure? I only spend €5 or whatever. And Simone, when we get on to you, I'm sure this is going to be relevant to Germany. Do you find that you have to break that down in focus groups?
Yeah, so we at Wine Intelligence, we do a lot of online surveys with representative samples of consumers in 36 markets now globally, and then also face-to-face focus groups, ethnographies. And what we have to do is to be really mindful of the fact, actually, that wine is still quite a social signifier. So when people are talking about wine, consumers are, to your point, talking about spend or brands or whether I buy into Bordeaux or Burgundy, Tuscany, any region, Napa of the world. There is this sort of self-actualization, if we kind of can go a bit to Maslow and think, which is, you know, so pertinent in the circumstance we're in at the moment. But this idea that somehow wine still, to most of us around the world, is a social signifier of our kind of social status and where we sit in the world. So that's why we feel a bit dumb when we go to a restaurant, and hopefully we'll all be able to return to those soon. And we don't know what we're doing when we open the wine list. And, you know, I'm sure we've all been there where the wine list gets passed around the table very rapidly. No, you choose. You choose, because you don't want to be seen as kind of not knowing what you're doing or how you're going to do that. So because wine has this sort of social signifier attached to it, it becomes a sort of reflection of how we want to see ourselves and also how we want to be seen to the outside world.
Lulie, can I ask a question about this?
Yeah.
How do you overcome the self-reporting bias for, you know, your interviews and focus groups?
Yeah, so part of it, if we're talking about focus groups, part of it is it's the moderator's job to clearly state in front of the room, you know, I want to talk, you know, I want you to talk about your honest answer. I want your feedback. There's no right or wrong answers. I'm not going to judge. I'm not an expert. It's really important for a moderator to state that in front of a room. And also a moderating technique we use is what we call mirroring. So we don't use any technical wine jargon when we're in focus groups, and we wait to hear how consumers talk about varietals or regions, or so we're mirroring back their language. When it comes to surveys, so to Robert's point and your question, Polly, in terms of spend, yes, there is absolutely an overstatement of typical spend. You know, we would be very happy in the wine industry if consumers really spent the amount they say they spend. Part of it is because they don't know. Part of it is because they're buying on promotion, but they're thinking at the actual total retail price. And part of it is this kind of self-actualization I was talking about earlier. So to negate it, to your question, Polly, what we do is we look at rankings and index. So we're looking at proportional spend. So we're saying these types of consumers spend more and these types of consumers spend less. And then we can index that to the actual value spent within the market. So we have to do some sort of not alteration, that sounds the wrong word, but we have to do some recoding of the data to bring it back in line with the actual value that's happening and spend that's happening in the market against what's reported.
Thank you. Actually, that's a perfect moment for me to hand over to Simone, because Germany, whether we like it or not, price comes up into the conversation, even within Germany, but certainly from people trying to export to Germany very, very early. So how do you feel about this in terms of what you've seen in research?
I can first welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. It's a great idea to use this time, everyone being home and doing some really interesting stuff. I can really find myself absolutely clearly in Lulie's words. We have exactly the same issues and measuring real data. And we in Germany, we have like both sides. We have a lot of low price volumes being sold in discount stores and in supermarkets. And I'm very well aware of doing research where we look at people's baskets and trolleys, and we can see what they buy. And if we ask them what they actually do buy, it's a different story. And we call this the 1 to 2 euro lie, which of course in many markets, a 1 to 2 euro isn't a lot, but in Germany, it's about 50% of the told average value. The second thing is, Lulie already told is, well, it's a very differentiated product. We have so many SKUs. And there's a second issue in the producer markets, like Germany is one. We have so many different channels to look at. So if you are in a country like UK, where most is running through supermarkets or maybe on premise, in Germany, we still have this specialty trade or the cellar doors. And these are so hard to track. It's so hard to get some reliable data of this, A, regarding volume, and B, regarding value. We've trying to get hold on some first viable data, but already asking producers is a big issue, because not all of them have a warehouse software where they can push on a button and it tells them how much they sell.
You also, sorry, so you also have another factor, which is you have a certain number of Germans, depending where they live, who will go across the border.
Yeah.
And you don't really know how much. And from what I've understood, quite a lot of what those Germans buy in France or in Italy in particular tends to be at a higher price. They're not saving money necessarily, because they can do that at Aldi or Lidl at home. They're often buying more premium products than they would be at home.
Yes, I fully agree that it had been an issue. We've been looking at how much is actually coming across the border, and we are also asking consumers, and it's only about 3% what they tell us. And if you look at, of course, where can you transport a lot of wine? It's if you go by car. So if you do air travel, that's very limited, of course. So we rather believe that because the air traffic has a rather increased, that taking wine over the border might not have been an issue, rising a lot in the last years, being maybe rather stable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
If you allow me, one last little bit is, Lulie told us about the problem of asking people. Last year we've done an experiment looking at panel data from Nielsen. And we also had the option to actually ask the Nielsen panel member about what they believe and how much wine they drink. And it was for us a staggering finding that there was a mismatch of a third. So basically for about a third of the people, they told us, yes, I drink wine, but we didn't find any purchase data. Or they say, well, I don't buy wine, I don't drink wine, but we found some purchases. So, you're asking yourself, well, what can you do about this? It's how large is the error you're having? And a third is not a small number.
Now, the interesting thing is that within our countries, if you like, of the UK and Germany, we do at least have Nielsen data covering a certain amount of the business. When we start, as you said, there's quite a chunk in Germany that isn't covered, actually a bigger chunk than in the UK. But if we go to the States, Paul, the actual retail track data is far less useful by my understanding.
It's pretty minimal. It's the major big box stores. I think Nielsen and IR cover about 29% of the market. So that means that you're not visible to see 71% of the market. That's pretty weak. I think there's a big problem that we don't talk about, and this covers across all countries. I think to some, wine is a super long tail consumer packaged good. There's nothing else like it that we have. There's not, you don't go into a supermarket or to a store and you see 200 different types of milk or 200 different types of bread or 200 different, it's pretty staggering. And it's super long tail, like books, music, movies, but you can't deliver it digitally. So, I think in the United States last year, we had 200,000 different products approved for the TTB. And that's a compounding problem, right? So last year's products didn't go bad. So now that's 400,000 products, and you keep adding it up. And, as you start to degrade Pinot Grigios, some rosés, it's a lot of products in the market. It's also a very bimodal product. Everything from just, alcohol delivery at the low end to really, luxury experience to the top end. And we try to group it as wine, as one category. It's two different behaviorally tools for. I think that's what's really hard in wine data is forget about panels, forget about because it's fragmented, because it's across different channels, because it's across different sources. At least in the United States, when you try to look at observation data through either social media or tools like Vivino or Delectable, there's a fidelity problem at a certain price point. So every dollar you go below $20 suggested retail price, the fidelity gets harder and harder to see because people aren't really clamoring on social media or on Facebook or on Vivino to say, well, I love this Boda box, or I really like this Sutter Home Wines Zinfandel. Not that those products are not consumed in mass or really enjoyed. It's just people don't use those mechanisms and tools to talk about it. But every time you get, yeah, go on.
It's interesting. You're raising a very interesting point, because if we look at our markets, Germany has always been a very heavily private label. I mean, brands are not strong. In Britain, actually, private label has grown more in recent years, as it is growing in the States. But I would say across the three countries, the States, your brands are stronger than in our countries. But I still question, and you're kind of alluding to this, but I'm interested for Lulie and Simone to jump in as well, how aware people are of what they've bought. When you've just talked about music and movies and books. I think people are probably more likely to remember the author or the book or the name of the movie or the music quite often than the wine. That's that Spanish wine I have, or it's a Merlot, it's whatever. Who made it? Where did it come from? It's often pretty loose. Maybe in the States they have a better handle of it than they do in other countries. But you've been tracking what people, you're not doing it now necessarily, but you've been tracking what people talk about wine online, haven't you, historically? Paul?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We measured when I ran Vintank, we were doing 20 million conversations a day through social media and culling and cultivating. That's a lot.
And how aware do you think people are of brands and regions when you?
So I can mathematically tell you, across all of social media, everything that we ingested, only about 450,000 people wrote a tasting note. So that's a very small microcosm.
Out of how many again?
About 80 million people. About 8 million people said brand, variety, or region. So I'm talking the lowest barometer. So they said I had a Napa wine, I had a Chardonnay, or I had a Mondavi. So that's 8 million out of that. And the rest said I had a glass of wine with my girlfriends. I was out with my husband last night, I had a glass of wine. I was out with my wife on a date. We had this wonderful red wine. It's very low engagement.
And Lulie, you, I think, recently, I remember an event with you, you pointed out that people will say in the UK, for example, that they drink Pinot Bianco, and we know that they don't, because we don't have the volumes of Pinot Bianco. And the question is, are they thinking of Pinot Grigio or Pinot Noir or Pinot Blanc? Sorry, not Pinot.
It was Pinot Blanc, yes.
Pinot Blanc, yes. It was Sauvignon Blanc or Pinot.
Yeah. So that was a really interesting one, Robert, for you to remember there. So in the UK, just as one example, we had, and I should know the number off the top of my head, a high proportion of consumers who said they drank Pinot Blanc. And really, when we delved into it through the interviews and the focus groups and the ethnographies, actually what consumers, to your point, Paul, were doing was mixing up Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Grigio, because they're two really kind of common words in wine. And you kind of see the word Pinot and you see the word Blanc and you think, that's something I've heard of. It kind of makes sense. That does make it very difficult from a research integrity perspective to actually get the real data in terms of what people are doing. But I would put forward to all of us that actually the reality of what consumers are choosing and doing kind of doesn't matter. What matters is the perception of what they think they're doing. So if they think they're drinking Pinot Blanc, then that's important for us to understand, whether that's a reality or not. The perception is actually, for me, much more important than the reality. We had a classic one, and I know I watched your fantastic episode yesterday, Robert and Polly, on a natural wine. So when we started at Wine Intelligence, measuring what we call solar wines, so that's sustainable, organic, lower alcohol and alternative, which we started 3 years ago, we had a lovely list, which was organic, biodynamic, etc., etc. And it included natural wine. And what we found on average of the 14 markets that we tested it in around the world, around 70% of consumers drank natural wine. And we went, clearly that's not possible, because we know how much natural wine is produced versus the total wine that's produced in the world. So when we talk to consumers, what we hear is, well, wine is natural.
Mm. Yeah.
You know, and so that's really important to understand. You know, we as an industry can kind of laugh and scoff and go, oh, you know, consumers don't know what natural wine is. But it's really important to understand their perception, which is wine is natural. So, for example, if you are a natural wine producer, how do you differentiate that between what consumers think is just normal for wine?
Well,
so, yeah. Go on, Robert.
No, I think it's interesting. But in fact, I've got Damien Wilson, who I think, again, several of us know from Sonoma University, who was on the other evening we were doing education. I'd like to, Damien has a question about personal bias, but talking about sustainability in wines. That's relevant to because you've done a lot of work on that, I know, Lulie, but that ties in with what you're talking about natural wine. Damien, go ahead.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, I just to reiterate that point on the sustainability, I was involved in a committee meeting yesterday, and I had a senior student, so she's been studying sustainability for 4 years, and was asked by the committee about how important the concept of sustainability is now for students who are coming in. They're thinking about putting communications together. And the student was adamant that students come in with the idea that sustainability is a decision-making factor on their college decisions coming up in the new academic year. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but if anyone's noticed it, but there's this pandemic going on, which kind of might influence some people's focus on issues to do with security instead of perhaps the using sustainability as a concept. But it just illustrates that fact that what we focus on, what we have attention in, and us in the wine industry, our expertise makes us biased towards that particular topic. And just on what Lulie was
we don't
saying,
even use that topic right, Damien, just to be fair. I mean, sustainability through the lens of the wine industry is often about production sustainability, environmental sustainability. It's not really tied into what we really need is, you know, business channel sustainability, financial stability, employee health stability, community stability, which we're seeing en masse through this, you know, this pandemic. I mean, the restaurant industry is devastated. Our employees are out of work at wineries right now in Napa Valley because the taste rooms are closed.
Yeah, that brings up, sustainability is a much broader concept.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Paul. But in the scheme of things, it goes to my point. This idea that we too easily focus on topics that are personally relevant to us, as does the time. I mean, at the moment, it's difficult to imagine to go back and think what things might be like in the future because we're all really affected by the current situation at the moment. So I think that's one of the challenges that I had, and the question I put out to the panel. How many of you have had success in actually getting people to think beyond their own experience or the current environment as a way to kind of recognize what the data tells us from the research we've found? That's something that I personally have difficulty conveying, and whether it's about natural wines or whether it's about the concept of sustainability, I'm not arguing about the embracing nature of any of these concepts. I'm talking about the ability to get professionals to make decisions based on what the data is telling them, not what they personally believe.
Thank you, Damien. Simone, dive in.
Well, we are dealing with a lot of winemakers, and I think if you're a small business owner, very few can just make decisions based on data. Most of them really have to stand in with their heart and their feelings, and that's why I believe the wine industry is special in it's not the large CEOs, companies. Data will be part of it. But most are saying, well, we are doing a long-term story. We are here for generations. We are only having one harvest a year. So we have to think long-term and we have to understand the full picture. But personally, my feeling and my understanding is that those who are doing business research and those who are interested in the business side are much more successful. And we have several points in that. One is we are having a producer panel. And those interested are much more successful because they're interested in business. We are having a panel of where we're looking at balance sheets, and unfortunately it's self-selection bias. Not everyone is forced to do it, so you are not representative. And those who do it are much more successful than the average. And the third quick point is we are now doing a postgraduate studies, and we ask the industry, what do you want to learn? Do you want to learn to make better wines? Do you want to learn more and more about viticulture? You know what the industry told us? We need to learn to do business.
I second what she's saying. And look, let's take away some of this larger macro data insights and macro trends. I mean, the reality of it is the businesses just knowing their own data, knowing their own customers is right in front of us. We've had that for some time, and we haven't leaned into leverage that piece. We've been very fortunate, at least in the United States, that we've had double-digit growth for decades. We've had booming eno-tourism that only has been affected in the last 3 years through the fires, the blackouts, and now through a pandemic, which none of us had on our bingo card, that's coming in pretty heavy. There's lots of data that the wineries have of their own DTC consumers, of their own 3-tier that they're sending, that they can do some really good insights and unlock for increased sales and retention. I think that, these macro trends are wonderful, and the businesses that really can take advantage of them have the time to stop and think strategically. So oftentimes the small businesses, to Simone's part, don't have that luxury the same way. But I can tell you, whether it's Wente or Duckhorn, whether it's Gallo or Constellation, whether it's Pernod Ricard or Delicato, and whether you like these brands or not, it doesn't matter. They really think with data in a new way, and they're getting smarter and smarter and creating whole insights teams to leverage this in new and meaningful ways.
But could I interrupt for a second, which I think you're absolutely right. There we've got big companies who've got, Gallo spends huge amounts. If we come down to smaller people, I think one of the points I can see is that the wine industry tends historically to have behaved in a very feudal manner. I make wine, I give it to him, he's a merchant, and he a wholesaler, and he sells it to the retailer, and so on. And we're very distanced, and we know that we have wholesalers who only deal with restaurants, for example, and they don't. And I think what we're seeing through the current situation is that's having to break down. We're seeing wineries who are having to do direct because the other routes to market aren't working, and we're seeing, for example, wholesalers who are now selling to retail customers because the restaurants are closed. So potentially we're going to see far greater accrual of data because the producers and various levels are getting closer to the end user. Are you seeing that in Germany or in the UK, Lulie? Simone, either of you?
Lulie, do you want to go ahead?
No, you go ahead, Simone.
Well, what we see is that the eno-tourism has came to a full stop. So consumers visiting the wineries, getting the wine cellar doors, that stopped. So the wineries are now basically telling, oh, I need an online shop urgently. So we are working with a collaborator who just brought on 300 new online shops for wine producers. At the same time, the big ones, like Havasco and others, they just can't really make work happening because there's so much demand. And there is now a discussion in the industry, well, this will bring a stronger concentration because the few big stores who already are in place, who are well known, they will do much better than the small ones only getting started. So that's what we can hear from different people. It's so hard to make an online store happening, make it successful. You can reach out to your own clients, but then how to gain new ones. That's a story or a job that people didn't learn.
No one has the answer to that question currently, to be really honest with you. It's untapped because no one's invested in that category at the producer level in a meaningful way yet. It's all blue ocean strategy.
Yes.
Polly talks about it all the time.
I'm being good and quiet.
I've got a question. I've got a point from Adam Vignola, which actually is pertinent to all of this in terms of actually the business that all three of you are in terms of data gathering. Adam, can you hear me and can you speak? I hope you can. Adam Vignola. Otherwise, I'll read your question if I can't. Adam, go ahead.
Sure. My question.
Where are you? Where are you, Adam? Just out of interest.
I'm in Afghanistan.
Go ahead.
So Rob McMillan suspended his direct-to-consumer survey this year because he didn't feel he'd have a significant amount of data collected.
Sorry to interrupt. Just for those who don't know, that is the survey that the Silicon Valley Bank does of US wineries, particularly California wineries, in terms of how they see the market and what the trends they see. Go ahead, Adam.
And this is just the DTC one, Robert. They've already done the annual one, just so you know.
Go ahead, Adam.
Correct, Paul. But I was just wondering, just in a general sort of question, how do you think the data will be this year? Or are you going to have trouble getting data? Obviously, Nielsen data is non-existent when you don't have, as many people going out shopping as you had in the past before COVID-19.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thanks, Adam. Can I jump in on that one, Robert?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we, Wine Intelligence, we run global surveys, syndicated surveys 4 times a year. One of our waves is in March. So what we've actually done is we've adapted our base pack questionnaire, so our standard tracking questions. So we've asked all of the same questions, which are questions like, over the last 6 months, how often do you typically drink wine to relax at home? How often do you drink wine when you're out celebrating, on premise, off premise, typical spend, varietal, country, etc. So we've kept all of those questions, but then we've added in a new module, which says, under current circumstances, as an impact of COVID-19, how has your immediate behavior changed? So we're collecting data. In fact, I was just checking in with the team today, and we launched 16 surveys this week. And we had about the same last week. So we are actually collecting data right now. And what we're trying to do is look at, for example, in countries like South Korea, who were ahead of the curve in terms of the impact on life generally, compared with other countries. How has behavior changed? Actually, how are consumers changing their behavior? And one of the things we're also looking at in that is, how is their brand behavior changing? Our expectation, and we will have the data in the next couple of weeks, is that consumers are moving towards more familiar brands, more brands they're comfortable with. What happens, consumer behavior is, in times of, when we're back to Maslow, moving down the hierarchy, consumer behavior says go to safe. And what safe is in our world is the big brands, and often sold in the larger formats. So we're particularly seeing that, Paul, in the US, which is an increase in the 1.5 litres. And we're seeing it in markets like Sweden, where there's an increase in the bag-in-box, which is obviously a larger proportion of the market. So I actually think it's really important to collect data now, and not to say, no, we're not going to collect data because it's a bit of an anomaly. If reality is perception, to my point earlier, then we need to know what the perception is today, and we'll need to collect that data again in a month or 2 months' time, and then 2 months from that, and then 2 months from that, so that we can understand and track what consumers are actually doing in terms of their daily life with our category.
Could I just chip in? Because if we go back, I know Polly's got a question, but just picking up on that, if we go back to the recession, after that, 2 things happened. One was NPD, new product development, dried up. Yeah. And 2, my friends who are label designers, including my business partner's label designer, all of the wacky new designs for wine labeling stopped, and people went back to Spanish wines with traditional Spanish labels and so on. So that plays very much to what you're saying. People actually weren't being adventurous. Polly, you had a question.
I have a couple questions. So Paul, because your data comes from post-purchase data in many cases, is that correct?
Yeah, we actually measure post-purchase. Yeah.
You measure post-purchase, so concrete, and only by concrete, I mean, it's not self-reported. There's not the human element involved in our perception. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that compares to what what Lulie is saying?
Yeah, I'm a different thought process than Lulie in that piece. I mean, first of all, I think we should always be collecting data. I think that this data collection is happening around us all the time. It's what we're doing with that data, whether it's coming in through our Google Analytics, whether it's coming through the social engagement that's occurring with our brand, or it's coming through our transactional data that's coming through either our cellar door direct-to-consumer sales or what's in the broad market of, you know, account sold data. There's a lot to unlock from those trends and behaviors that are factual and actual. I'm not really a survey guy, to be honest with you. I know sample groups are important and add value, but it's not where I like to lean in. I like to lean into much more large data observed stuff or actual transactional data in a real meaningful way, and cluster those. I think that Rob's choice to do that was not really about not wanting to collect the survey data. He had other methodologies and other reasons for not doing that, including the fact that the bank itself is really scrambling to make sure the wineries survive, I think. I think that the reality is all of our wineries are going to be able to tell an interesting story that will change a behavior. And really what I think is the most positive thing that we can take from this pandemic is that wineries are now aware that this channel is a meaningful, significant channel for them to sell to that's outside of just the tasting room. So that's my soapbox. I'm done.
I've got a question from Felicity. You just talked about changing behavior, and I think Felicity Carter, editor of Mining, is my colleague on Mining is Wine.
One of our favorite people too.
Has got a question about changing behavior. Felicity, go ahead.
I've actually got two questions. The first one is I want to see Paul's shoes. But my question to the panel is, they say it takes 30 days to form a new habit. And everyone in lockdown across the world, we can see from online sales that people are drinking enormous amounts of wine, including in markets where wine consumption has been dropping for the last few decades. Do you think that what's happening at the moment is forging new wine habits with people, or do you think it's a blip? I mean, are we going to see continued sales after this is over or not?
Maybe hi Felicity, if I jump in on that one to start with. As human beings, in the way we are today, you could say we've kind of been developing or evolving for several hundred years or potentially even several thousand years. What we do know is that habits don't shift quickly. So the sales data that we're seeing this week, last week, the week before, is primarily about stockpiling. We don't know yet whether that's drawing through to actually changing in consumption frequency and volume. So we know people are buying it, but we don't know whether people are actually drinking it more. You know, I'm kind of doing my bit, but we don't know whether people are actually drinking it more on a frequent basis. And I saw a really interesting question from, I think it was Andrew earlier about, you know, were we at Wine Intelligence, which is a great question, biasing by kind of predicting the answers before we know it. What we're actually doing is saying, well, let's kind of try and find out how much people are actually drinking or are changing their behavior. So back to the kind of macro, our prediction, but we have the data to Andrew's question from Brazil and Australia, which I was reviewing today. So we actually have new data in that is showing how these changes in habits are happening. So we have some evidence to base it on there. But what we will really be looking at is, are those trends going to stay for the long term? The prediction is we will see blips, but ultimately we will revert back to previous behaviors. The biggest difference, I think, this time round will be economic, in terms of how much cash is in our pockets as consumers and how buoyant we feel about spending. And back to you, Paul, if we look at what has happened in terms of the enormity in the spike in registrations in the US for your equivalent of unemployment benefit. Sorry, I can't quite remember the term. To see that spike in a chart is in 2 weeks is quite phenomenal. So consumer confidence, I think, is really going to have an impact actually in terms of what products we choose.
I think I'd like to move on to Simone here. And there's a question that it is quite interesting picking of this is actually this question of volume of drinking, B, there's a question of how we're drinking, because there's a lot of data I've seen from France of people whose regularity of wine consumption had dropped radically. They weren't, the number of people who drink wine every day under 60 had fallen off a cliff, and the people who are drinking once or twice a week or whatever. And I think I've seen similar data for Germany. I'd like to hear what you've got to say on that. If we're all locked up in our homes and we're not going anywhere, we're not driving, you know, we haven't got those constraints, are you seeing that? And this is actually Carlos Eduardo Mazon actually raised this in a sense. He thinks it's a blip, but he's questioning how that works. So Simone, where are you on this?
Well, what we see is that in Germany, wine is a very social beverage. So it's about you meet people, you enjoy your life, you discuss things. And if you can't really meet, you have to drink on your own. That's the situation at the moment. And my feeling is, and what we hear from different people is, in Germany, there are rather beer or other beverages you drink on your own, whereas wine is something you don't really, you open a full bottle and then you're alone with that. I believe that, again, I fully agree with Lulie, it's more the stockpiling we see. You know, look at all the toilet paper purchases. It's not that the consumption radically increased. It's really about this anxiety. Can I still buy it in a few weeks' time? And I just talked to someone, a cigarette producer, and they say exactly the same. People are maybe consuming a little bit more because they feel less distraction, but at the same time, they just want to be safe that there is something in the cupboard in 2 weeks' time and we don't know what's going on.
I think it's a little different here in the United States. If you just saw Esther Mobley did an article about Bay Area consumption and the alcohol device, and we're definitely, our alcohol BAT is up in the United States. So we're definitely drinking more US based. They're measuring through the,
beer?
They don't, that's unclear. And I don't know what the clarity on that piece. Obviously there's wine increase that we're seeing. So I don't know which of those things, you know, I know I'm definitely consuming more wine. I can tell you that for sure. And earlier every day with 4 kids at home. So to answer Felicity's early thing, I don't think any of us know. I don't think any of us know. I think that this would be a huge guess of what this is going to look like afterwards. We see transitions, and none of us could have guessed in this room that hard seltzer was going to be a big deal. There's not a single one of us that would have predicted that a year ago or 2 years ago, right?
And it still is a US phenomenon even now.
Yeah, exactly.
Polly, you've got a question, I think, a practical question.
Yeah, so actually I'm curious to know, we've talked a lot about the theory, aggregation of data, but at some point this has to go from being an expense to being an investment. And can we talk a little bit about the work that each of you are doing with data and how you see that being adopted, maybe what the challenges are, implementation, and some takeaways that wineries can leave here and, you know, go make their own better data decisions?
Lulie, lead the way.
Yeah, okay, over to me. One of the areas that we work in, probably most out of all of the different types of research that we do, is brand health tracking. So that's for individual product brands, but also for region health tracking and country health tracking, if that makes sense. And that data is particularly used strategically with wholesalers, distributors, and then retailers, and in the good old days, on-premise operators. So if you're talking about, Polly, practical use of data and insight, a lot of that tracking work that we do, our producers, clients, our regional clients, take that evidence to their customers, retail customers, on-premise customers, and demonstrate who is buying, why they're buying, what they're thinking about those particular, so why there is a benefit for having their particular region or their particular brand as part of the mix within the retailer's portfolio. So there's a really kind of practical evidence. And to your point, way back at the beginning, Robert, when you were talking about You know, we all have an opinion. You know, sherry's doing really well because I've seen it in hipster bars in Brooklyn and Düsseldorf and London, and Barcelona for those of us on the panel, on the call. So what it really helps to have that evidence to put in front of your customers, to be able to say to them, look, this is the independent fact and independent evidence that shows where the position is and what the opportunity is. So that's partly address your question, Polly.
Yeah, definitely.
Polly, you're there, aren't you? Polly?
I am here. I'd love to hear what Simone and Paul both have to say, because I think that there's so much confusion in line about what kind of data should we be looking at? How do we use it? How can we bring that in-house and make strong, practical business building, you know, consumer, more product, new product decisions? So that's really what I'm getting at. So you two go for it.
Simone, go ahead.
Yeah, ladies first for sure.
Thank you very much. Well, we have a very similar approach, what Lulie just talked about. For instance, to give you an idea, we have an export project where it's about exporting wine to different markets. Each of the small wineries would not have been able to do the research on their own. It would have been too expensive. But we just told them, you know, you can take this evidence to your importer, to the retailer in the market you want to go to, and, you know, give them some advice on, okay, I'm important. My clients would love to have the wine on the shelves. I think this is kind of helping them to get traction in the market. The second thing is we are mainly working with German producers, and there's still this shift going from the older consuming, doing vino tourism. So having time, being retired, empty nests, having time and money to go to the winery, but actually they're not purchasing, you know, twice a year, a bunk full of wine and then drink it at home. The behavior shifted a lot. And the question is, if those old customers are dying, who are the new ones? Where are they? How can we get them? How can we approach them? How should we communicate? And this is really, I think, where it's about people sitting in the countryside, in the villages, trying to understand the city life, and then young people. This is some kind of transition where we are helping them to get an idea.
Paul.
Well, I'm quite different than the ladies. They're doing the really smart strategic thinking and market analysis and cohort analysis. I'm a really kind of a brass tacks company. So we really are just helping wineries rip apart their own data into 3 categories. You know, we're trying to have them look at their restaurant retailers, who's their best customers, who's their most frequent customers, who's declining, same with their direct to consumer customers. And we're giving them in really easy reports to say, hey, you know what? You should call these people today to thank them. You should email these people today. You should use this group as a lookalike audience in this market to acquire new customers that look like this. So we're really brass tack tactical, helping them unlock their own data. And almost we're kind of like, I'd almost say business first responders right now. We are busier than we've ever been, sitting there trying to help every single winery that we work with. And we're working nights and weekends to help them design campaigns, A/B tests, because right now that data that they're sitting on is the only way they're going to generate dollars in revenue and keep my neighbors employed, my friends, my businesses alive. So we're really in the heat of just that down and dirty. Please make sure you talk to these customers. Please make sure you do an email campaign to these customers. Please send cards to these restaurants. They used to be big buyers and they're closed now, but when they get to the other side, they may be open on the other side. So it's a lot of that work, really tactical stuff.
Can I cut across this in a sense? Because one of the things in data, one of the biggest problems I find, and I feel very sorry for a lot of wineries, and I'm a producer as well, so I know how this works, is that where do I get my data for, let's say I'm selling wine in Kazakhstan, or I'm selling my wine in South Korea or whatever. It will tend to come from my importer in that country. And I am going to get a view that comes from his part of the market. He may or she may give me a brilliant broad picture, or it may be entirely biased through the success of their sales team or where they happen to be. So actually I'll bump it. For example, I produce a Viognier in Languedoc. We struggle to sell our Viognier, but I know there are some markets that have had the right importer. They might be better at selling a Viognier, but it's how do you know the broader picture? And when it comes to reading, I find a lot of wine producers are very good at reading about the bit that affects them. They don't necessarily look at the broad picture of wine and how it might affect them. Lulie, do you, when you're talking to your clients, how, and I'm not talking about your biggest clients, but maybe some of the regions that you work with, how broad visioned are they?
I think, well, I've been running Wine Intelligence now for 18, nearly 19 years. And certainly the kind of broadening, to your question, Robert, of the vision of where regions or individual producers are looking at has certainly extended over the years that I've been running the business, if that answers your question.
Simone, because I do find a lot of people I meet in Germany, again, quite often do see things pretty much from where they're standing.
My feeling is that we are dealing a lot with the small producers in Germany who are only starting to understand that it's not about the production very much, but it's much more about the business side. And they're struggling really to find a big picture and the strategy. Of course, there's a lot of differences. You know, if you have like VDP wineries who are on the forefront and know how to make a brand and to build a brand, it's very different. But talking about the 80%, you know, of majority of producers, it's still very agricultural driven. Well, I produce once a year and then I look for my clients.
I've got back to the point. We're very lucky to have sort of audience from all over the place. We have got Lorenzo Biscontin, who used to be with Santa Margherita, who's in Italy, who's got some data from what happened in terms of purchasing in Italy after they've had the longest lockdown of anyone. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. Hi, everybody. No, just on the chat, there were a discussion about if people was buying wine in supermarkets more just to stock or to drink. And in Italy, what we are seeing is that in the first 2 weeks, the increase of sales in wine in supermarkets was around 15%. Like in the last week alone, in the 4th week of lockdown, the increase was 30%. So seems that the people are buying the wine to drink it. The point is, are we drinking overall more, or is just substituting the consumption that is lost in the on-trade? And that is the data that is missed.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lorenzo.
Can I jump in on that one, Robert?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So Lorenzo, thank you for sharing that with us. We actually just collected data in Italy 2 weeks ago to a week ago. So in about a week's time, we will be able to definitively answer your question there in terms of, is it stockpiling versus increased consumption? The early read of our data, so if I take Australia as an example, is obviously the on-premise is in decline. What we've seen in our Australia data is that the wine consumption is pretty similar with meal occasions at home. But what has changed is wine consumption with non-food occasions, and that's increased.
So having a drink because you need a drink, basically.
Yes. So that's what's that's what we've seen in the Australian data so far. And next week we'll be analysing the Italian data and the Brazilian data, and then it will be ongoing. But yeah, so it seems that, to your point, Lorenzo, that there, and my point I was making earlier, I think it's a combination of stockpiling and an increase in frequency of consumption at home, but we've also got then that decrease in frequency of consumption out of home. Okay. And what we're trying to figure out at the moment is that calculation between all of those.
I've got a comment from Barbara Lewin saying in Chile, there does seem to be, where only part of the population is locked down, but there does seem to be more drinking. Back to a point earlier about playing safe. I've got Katerina Kostovska from Macedonia. From the oldest. Katerina, go ahead and ask your question, because I think it's very relevant.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Well, actually, I'm particularly concerned about how the emerging regions or the emerging countries for wines, what about their predictions and how we are coping with future sales on the markets given the situation? Especially we've been working hard on the exports in USA and UK. And now, because we are not that strong brands outside, I'm not really sure how that will reflect on us.
It's a very good question, Katerina. Anyone on that?
Do you want me to jump in, Robert?
You
Unless
could, Lulie.
anybody else wants to. I don't want to hog, but if anybody else wants to. So it's a really interesting question. And to the point I was making earlier, what we do know that in times of kind of crisis or in times of stress on a supply chain is that as human beings, we tend to revert to the known rather than the unknown. So unfortunately, that's not a particularly positive answer to the question that you're asking, which is that innovation, NPD, new to market entrants, regions or brands will have a tougher time going forward over the next 6 months, year, 2 years, however long this period of where we are now and then into recession lasts. Because our human nature is to revert to what we know and feel safe and reassured by. So to the toilet paper comments that we've had many of them and we will continue to, the reason we've all gone and bought toilet paper, one is because everybody else is doing it, so we're panicking, but actually toilet paper is about control.
Yeah.
And it's about reassurance. And so that's what actually happens in brand behavior as well.
And there's just a broad, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Rara. Yeah, I don't think that we know. I think that the markets are being redefined clearly. I'll give you a small example in the United States. Retailers are now allowed to ship during COVID. That genie's out of the bottle. It's going to be hard to get it back in the bottle. That's a new route to market for new brands. Wholesalers are changing the way that they sell. Those genies are out of the bottle. Amazon's coming to the market. Home delivery, Drizzly, which has had its, is growing fast. I mean, there's a lot. And if we actually look back in time, and I don't disagree about, we go back to comfort, but after we get through a crisis or a problem, we tend to be humans as well. So if you guys remember that happened after the Spanish flu, there was the Roaring 20s in the United States. That was a great time to drink and party. That led to prohibition. So, I mean, there's a lot that's happening that we can't predict. I think that, and I think new brands have a chance to get to the market.
Okay, Paul, you're going to stay on the seat for a second because the obvious question, we're close to time, but I think it's a crucial question. Forgetting the situation we're in at the moment, which eventually will end, whether it's weeks or months, it will be over. The big question, surely, for the wine industry is the next generations of drinkers, whether we're talking about millennials or we're talking about Gen Z or whoever they are. There is a lot of evidence that the old idea that when you got to 30 years old, if you might have started off with Coca-Cola and beer, but you turned into a wine drinker as you got married and had kids and did all that stuff. There's a worrying amount of evidence for various markets that isn't necessarily happening now. It's not happening as automatically. And I'd love to hear from all the panelists how they see this change in generations. A, whether they're going to drink wine, or B, are they going to drink the same kinds of wines in the same kinds of ways as we've been doing in the past. And actually, Simone, why don't you start that for Germany? I'll come back to Paul in a minute. Simone, why do you look at that?
Well, we just had a study together with the Meininger and the German Wine Institute, where we had focus groups in Cologne, a rather tall city. And we actually could see the similar patterns we saw 20 years ago. So younger, 20 years old, just saying, well, wine, oh, I'm so insecure. I don't know what to choose. But they are kind of interested. And when they're above 30, they really start getting into it. So for Germany, I can't really say it's so different.
Okay. Lulie, looking globally, do you see anything?
Yeah, so there's a fantastic kind of myth that we have in our category, which is it's all the millennials' fault. How many times have we heard the blame on the millennial? I'm not quite sure who the millennial is, given that it's quite a broad age range and there's quite a lot of people around the world. We just ran a piece of data a couple of weeks ago, which actually on US and UK. So we were looking at people who were aged of legal drinking age up to 35, 10 years ago, and what proportion of them were drinking wine and at what rate. And then looking at legal drinking age people today up to the age of 35, so the millennial, and what proportion of them are drinking wine. The fact is, actually, it's the same. It hasn't dropped. The same proportion of people in that age group today are drinking wine in the US and the UK as were drinking wine 10 years ago.
That's really interesting.
What has changed is their frequency has gone down a little bit. So there aren't as many higher frequency drinkers in that age group. And what has changed is they have a broader portfolio of other alcoholic beverages. So that's what's taking the kind of high frequency stuff, because they're drinking, back to your point, Paul, the hard seltzer and everything else. But actually, the same proportion of people in that age group in the US and the UK are still drinking wine. So we haven't lost people. Millennials, the millennial is still drinking wine. Just how they're drinking wine and how they're engaging is shifting.
So I want to jump in on this. Sorry, Paul. Is it okay, Paul, if I jump in for a minute?
Of course, ladies.
All right, thank you.
Absolutely.
So, Lulie, I think you're right in that there's no homogenous, cohort, that the millennial doesn't exist. But I think that what you've touched upon is one of the reasons that good consumer data for our industry is so vital right now, because what millennials want is they want to be seen as their individuals. They have the strongest sense of individual identity of any generation since we've been tracking this kind of thing, and that's actually their own self-reporting. That's what they say. So when a winery, oh no, Paul has it. So what we're dealing with is that wineries, at least in our experience as marketers, wineries don't know who their customers are. They are relying on historic assumption or anecdotal, data from within communities, and that is hindering them from being able to not just speak to a millennial, but speak to a 65-year-old woman with millennial tendencies. So I think that when we're working, like when I work with data, it's really parsing it down to some very fine, tangible, precise identities, tactics that we can use. Paul, I mean, you do a lot of that kind of data work. So now I'll let you talk.
Yeah, no, we've done a lot. First of all, I'd recommend everyone watch Joe Fattorini did a speech at Wine to Wine that was excellent about millennials, and so did Paulie. But Joe did a really good one that actually speaks this. Those bulk measurements of like demographics are just bunk. The only thing demographics really tell you is your distance from birth, your approach to death, and where you are in your affluence, where you're making your money, that's kind of thing. And the millennials, which we talk about endlessly, they have been a little delayed and stunted in their gain of the affluence. But that being said, Gen X moved right into the wine category, right behind the boomers, carrying it through. Millennials will move right into that piece as well. It's just a function of the way that product exists in our nature and where we have money to spend against it. So, but to Lulie's point, we are competing against share of mouth, share of attention. I mean, for God's sake, I say this 100 times. When I was a kid, I didn't even know what kombucha was. And now there's a row at Whole Foods that I can't go to anymore that has 100 different kombuchas. That's a lot of choice, or hard seltzers, or microbrewed beers, or wine. Even growing up, wine was a much smaller category in the United States than it is now. So there's a lot more choice.
Can I just jump in there as well? Because you've just said something which I'm not sure. We've got people from all over the world watching this. But actually, how many people outside the US see kombucha in their local stores? They might see microbrewery beer, but they're not necessarily seeing it. I think that America, I would argue from where I'm sitting, has actually gone down a road of its own. We don't have hard seltzers in most other countries yet. They may be coming. They may change things.
I'm going to argue that. I'm going to argue that because I'm in lockdown with Glovo delivery, and I can get kombucha delivered to my house in lockdown in Barcelona. So I'm not certain that it's as restricted to the States as it used to be.
No, I don't. But I'm getting back to the anecdata question. In my local supermarkets, I don't know how you feel about this, Lulie, or you, Simone, there isn't. In the States, there is a chunk of it. There's 1 or 2 bottles in the health section or whatever in my store, if I see them at all. And hard seltzer definitely hasn't penetrated our markets at all in the way that you have it in the States. And the same thing would apply to one of the things I've been looking at, which is red blends. the idea, which I raised at the beginning, of spending the equivalent of $25 or $35 on a wine with no grape variety and no specific region on it, I think is still strange for most non-Americans. I'd be interested to know what you think about that, Simone.
Well, Bordeaux is a blend.
Yeah, but it has the Bordeaux word on it. I'm talking about
Claret,
wines,
a Claret is a blend too, right?
I'm talking about wines that you walk into a US store and there are now dozens of wines with strange names, strange labels, totally unfamiliar, and there is nothing about those wines that you can hold on to, that you can just say, I know that region, I know that grape.
Well, I'm not based in the US, but personally I believe that it's a much more innovative market. It has younger consumers, so it's predestinated to, being innovative, having new things we in the old European countries with the older consumers do not have. I think you can get some kombucha, but definitely not, several meters. And but you don't have the same size of supermarkets. They're very tall compared to other countries, but small compared to the US.
Lulie, you're looking globally. How do you see this?
Robert, in terms of what perspective? In terms of the range of beverages available, you mean?
What I'm saying, I think in a sense, is that what somebody is competing with in a store in America is not necessarily the same products they're competing with in a store in Germany or in other places.
Can I ask you one question though, Robert? Do you think that the internet flattens the world and that competition of being able to buy kombucha in Spain, in UK?
No. No, I'm going to maybe controversially and also presumably now with COVID that's changing things. Most people are still not buying online. And the people who are buying wine online very often actually know the kind of wine they want to buy, and they're possibly the top end. I'm talking about people who 80% of the wine is still sold in supermarkets, with people walking into those stores in most places, and they're still looking at the wall of alcohol and the wall of wine being part of that. So I'd just be interested, Lulie, just to go back to you, because you are looking at it globally. The share of throat question, which is what we're talking about, surely does differ from place to place.
Yeah, and that differs based on both kind of historical and cultural references that different countries have grown up over years. But certainly spending a lot of time in the States, as I have done over the last couple of months, and the kind of plethora of cans, not just of wine, but of all different alcohol, the plethora of beer particularly, and also hybrid and blended products. Being in Wegmans and being in the New York State and over in Washington and Safeways, and then over into San Francisco, and really seeing the range of products that are available to consumers, particularly in the refrigerated section, where it's the kind of cold, ready to go. And I don't know whether you see that, Paul, but that really is a big difference from the selection that we see typically in Europe, or even to a certain extent in markets in Asia and Australia.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is a kooky market in a lot of different ways. I mean, we're kind of crazy all around. But we're transforming with big supermarkets, and we do a lot of innovation and different components. I don't know that how it translates necessarily into different countries, because everyone's so specialized. I think countries like the UK emulate us a little bit more than countries that have domestic production like France and Spain and Italy. Germany also is a pretty decent import market as well. There's just so much transformation happening around the world at so fast, and it's been so slow. And I think that some of these things that you see that are really piquing your interest, Robert, whether it's hard seltzer or red blends, have actually existed in just different forms in the past. They're just coming back in different ways now. So whether it's, Bordeaux or Claret, whether it's, Bartles and James mixers that were back in the day, which are now called hard seltzer. I mean, history's repeating itself over and over again, and it globalizes itself just differently.
I've got, actually, we're 9 minutes over, so I think we're pretty close to wrapping. I've got a comment from Adam Vignola, who was talking earlier, saying that he'd be surprised that data from anywhere currently in the world doesn't show a cratering in sales, the reduction in the number of occasions, cancelled sporting events, conventions, corporate events, and so on. So many occasions where wine is served has to be setting of red lights and alarm bells. Let's try and look at a little bit optimistically. We are going to come out of this. It's going to be pretty tough for a lot of people, but in terms of advice to the smaller producers, the smaller distributors, because Lulie, you have a lot of pretty big clients who can afford to pay your fees and to buy the reports that you publish. Simone, again, you work with big companies, but also small ones. Can we look at what the small guys at the moment who are doing no data, who are really flying, what you were saying, Simone, they were doing what their father did and they're sort of doing what their neighbors do. What would be your short advice to, let's say, a young producer who doesn't have much money? What's the easiest thing for them to do to start to actually have more information, to move into to actually being a stronger player? Simone, I'd start with you on that.
Well, the first one is understand your clients, keep an email of him, understand who's coming to your cellar door, keep a telephone number. And then, of course, if you start online, understand the data. Who is it? Who's buying? What are they buying? Just use what you already have for free. And the next one is really about, join groups of young people, of young winemakers who are actually opening up new routes in cities, in young interested markets. I think that's for them still the most powerful device, instead of losing march into the large retailers. I think that's not something feasible for the smaller ones.
Lulie.
Yeah, I would say also connect into your regional associations or country associations. Certainly we sell lots of, or have deals and sell lots of information to those around the world. So actually they are a real source, not just of wine intelligence data, but of all sorts of information and data, regional associations and country associations. So that's already there for you often. And then I would say, particularly given the circumstance we're in at the moment, but it was also a trend anyway, is it's all about local. So actually the ambition is about what, if you're a smaller producer, what can you do at a local level and at a direct level? Because as we know, local customers can come back frequently. Because by nature of being local. So I know that there's obviously an issue in many markets in terms of realistically being able to deliver and the issues that we've got. But I think certainly the evidence we're seeing is that localism will become even stronger in the kind of medium term. Now, my view is, as you heard earlier, that maybe long term that will start to wane, but certainly in the medium term, that's a really good opportunity for smaller wineries.
Thank you. Polly, you also supply consultancy services in New Zealand and the States and elsewhere. What would your advice be?
My advice comes from me being a control freak. That's the qualifier, and having dealt with trying to resuscitate too many businesses that did not do what my answer is, which is own your data, own your platforms, make certain that when you are making decisions, you are making them with ethical. We have to be honest about that, but ethical data collection in mind, and that is your property.
Cool.
Yeah, again, sorry, Lulie, I have to disagree with you about the localism. I mean, look, everywhere wine is made is a pretty tight region of a lot of wineries in one place. There's no way that Napa could be supported by its local footprint. So I think that we really need to break away from that localism and really invest in digital, with the understanding that data collection is part of digital, have a good discipline. And if I was a small winery, I would be investing in people, processes, and programs in order to reach more customers across a larger geographic footprint, And as far as reports that are outside that for next days, I would definitely go with Silicon Valley Bank does a report annually every year. Ship Compliant does a direct-to-consumer report that's wonderful. Commerce 7 does an amazing report about conversion and different tools. So that'll help you sell more wine using those kind of tools and vehicles, because the reality is a small boutique winery is not going to have the elbow, the muscle power to fight for retail placements. They're going to have to fight on the DTC level or the cellar door to really be sustainable. And that's smartly through digital first, and then through everything else next.
I think I'd like to chip in with a few thoughts, because there is a lot of free stuff out of there. And there's a lot of cheap stuff out of there. I'm going to fly a brief flag for Mining as Wine Business International, which I'm involved in. And we do weekly stuff. Decanter has stuff online. There's a lot of data.
Buyer?
The buyer, definitely.
Buyer.
There's a lot of stuff that comes out that's online if you want to read it. And I'm surprised how often I meet people who actually are not keeping track of what's happening in the wine world around them, and they're surprised to know some pretty basic stuff. The second thing is social media. I think a lot of people still see it as an outgoing thing. I'm telling you, here I am on my balcony, and here I am doing all my stuff, and maybe communicating with my friends, but actually using Twitter as a search tool to find out what people are talking about. It doesn't cost money to do that sort of thing. I think that actually to start asking the who, what, where, when, where, why questions, rather than actually starting with an assumption that I make wine here, people are going to want to buy it. Actually saying, why are people, I don't like Pinot Grigio, or I don't like Prosecco. Why are people buying that stuff? That doesn't mean to say I have to start making it myself, but maybe to try and understand the behavior people are doing, and maybe the fact they do like that label more than my label. That's a totally personal view. I think, sorry.
To jump in on the back of that, I would like to add another key issue we see in wine/data, together or separately, is we need to actually look at data from not wine. We need to be following the idea that we are only competing with ourselves or with kombucha, even, that's branching out, and that is still too siloed for where we are right now. We are competing with perfumes, as Robert likes to talk about, and I talk about handbags, or mortgages in
wallet share.
And so we do need to understand consumer behaviors, expectations, spending across a board, not just wine.
I agree.
I think we're 17 minutes over. I'd like to thank everybody from the left to the right: Lulie Halstead, Wine Intelligence; Simone Loose from Geisenheim University; Paul Mabray from Emptree; Polly Hammond, my partner in crime here; everybody who's turned up and asked questions or just watch. I should be able to tell you what we're doing on Monday, and I don't think I can yet, so that's going to appear in the next 24 hours. Please go, if you haven't seen them already, please go to the YouTube channel. You can find it easily. Just look up Real Business of Wine and you'll find it there. And we've got almost everything we've done so far is already up there. You can watch them all. There's Jancis Robinson, there's Bordeaux, there's wine writers. We had Eric Asimov from the New York Times talking the other day, and there's a lot there, biodynamics and so on. And register to subscribe to the channel there, and you'll be kept up to date with everything we're doing. But can I say thank you again, everyone. Have a great weekend. Please do take care, stay indoors, and hope to see you here on Monday at the same time. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
again.
Thank you.